Great, so this is a vodcast meant to be really a review of the work we've been doing in class around macromolecules, the molecules of life. When I started as a biology teacher, I used to do a lot of lecturing on this subject. As you know, I now am convinced that it's the in-class POGIL work that we're doing that it's actually going to be most effective for your long-term understanding. But I found that students also kind of enjoy or want this sort of directed teacher-centered lesson. So I'm putting this vodcast together for you guys for that purpose. Let me take you back to some context around what the work we did in ecology. So if you remember one of my first vodcasts in ecology, we talked about I walked you through the levels of organization. We started with a species, and we talked about how the species makes up a population and how population makes up a community of populations, and how the community is part of the ecosystem, right, the biotic part, and then of ecosystems are, of course, part of those major reservoirs on Earth, in particular the biosphere, right? So if we worked our way back down, and we could start with species and the individual within those species, we'd call them multicellular organisms for the most part. Those multicellular organisms are made up of various organ systems, and we'll talk about that closer to the end of the year, but you can think about your central nervous system, for example, or your immune system. Those organ systems are made up of organs, like your heart or your brain, or parts of your brain. Those organs are made up of tissues. Those tissues are all made up of cells. Those cells are all made up of molecules. And of course, those molecules are made up of atoms. So right now, we're focusing on the molecule part and, of course, exploring the makeup of their atoms, how the structure of those molecules dictate their function, as I keep repeating in class. So we're right here with the goal of working our way back up towards cells, tissues, organs, and organ systems, and then evolution and genetics as well, of course. My goal for this vodcast is really in two parts. One, I want you to be able to define organic compounds. I think you already can. And I want you to be able to list the main classes of macromolecules important to life. And really, I want, of course, you to be able to explain how they're important to life, but we're going to continue working on that in class. So let's start with defining the term organic compound. Organic compound really means carbon-based, right? So organic chemistry is carbon-based chemistry. And so the reason why that's relevant here is that all of our organic molecules, all the molecules important for life, are carbon-based. And so if you think back to the work we've already done on carbohydrates, so those sugars have a carbon ring at the center. If you think about our amino acids that make up the macromolecule proteins, they have a carbon at the center of that structure. The nucleic acids that make up DNA and RNA, they have the central carbon ring and other carbon structures. And of course, our lipids, those fats and oils, have those big long hydrocarbon chains that we talked about. So the reason that carbon is so versatile is the fact that it has 4 valence electrons, right? So it essentially has 4 electrons that are available for bonding. So it can make 4 bonds, 4 covalent bonds, I should say. And that is important because those 4 bonds, of course, can bond to itself, carbon to carbon, as well as the other 5 of the big 6 macronutrients, right? So it's carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, if you don't remember. And it can make all sorts of shapes. So carbon can make all sorts of shapes, whether it's bonding with itself or other compounds, or so other elements, excuse me. So if you just look at the examples I gave you here to make this point, so here we have a ring of carbon, and you see some double bonds here. Of course, each of these carbons is making 4 bonds. Over here, each of these carbons is making 4 bonds as well, but this ring has no double bonds. So you have 2 different types of rings that have different shapes because of the different bonding patterns. All right, and there's actually been other elements proposed as potential elements that could serve as the basis for life. Not here on Earth. Everything we're aware of, everything we've ever discovered, every living organism, I should say, is carbon-based. But we've looked down the periodic table of elements in group 14, which is known as the carbon family. We've looked at things like silicon, right? Silicon, excuse me. Because of the fact that it has 4 valence electrons as well. So people have hypothesized about silicon-based life forms, not carbon-based life forms. But again, all life we know of, at least as of today, is carbon-based. So Here are 4 classes of biological molecules. They're all organic molecules, right? You should be well familiar with all of those. We're going to focus on carbohydrates. The rest of the macromolecules I'll make other vodcasts for. Now, I want you to remember for all of these vodcasts that what I'm really interested in understanding is how the structure of these molecules lead to their function. That's a theme throughout our entire course. We could have done that in ecology. We did do that a bit in ecology, but I really want to emphasize that in this unit, and so you can take that forward to our future units. But this vodcast, because I don't want it to go on forever, is really going to be focused on the function of carbohydrates, and the other vodcasts are going to be on the function of the macromolecules. I'll allude and reference the structure, but I'm really relying on your work in class, think of all those pogos we're doing and other activities, to think through how the structure we're studying leads to the function. So keep that in mind. So with carbohydrates, I want you to know that they serve as both a fuel and building material. That's really the main 2 functions of carbohydrates. So you should be asking yourself, how does the structure I've already studied lead to those 2 functions, the fuel and the building material? So this podcast will help. Now, for carbohydrates, I want you to be thinking of 2 categories of carbohydrates, so subcategories of carbohydrates, sugars and then polymers of sugars. So let's start with the sugars. You've already studied them, the monosaccharides and the disaccharides. That's what we're really going to refer to as sugar. Okay, so let's dig into the monosaccharides. You guys remember the chemical formula, right? The ratio C1 to H2 to O1, right? So all of our sugars are going to have some multiple of that in the most part. Glucose, you guys know the formula for. Glucose is going to be one of our primary sources of energy. The cell's going to want to use that energy or use it as the energy source for a lot of functions. Whenever it needs to move, well, let me go into that later. But there's lots of actions within the cell that glucose is going to power. And you guys already know why glucose is such a great energy source when the body needs to do things very quickly, as opposed to those lipids that it stores more energy but aren't used when the body needs fast energy. So go back to your notes if you're confused on that. Let's talk about the disaccharides. You guys know that di references two sugars, right? So these are 2 monosaccharides joined together by that covalent bond. Glycosidic linkage is the name for that bond. You don't need to know that for this course. I'm just putting these things in brackets in case you want to go on and study it a little bit more. It's up to you, but not going to be on our test. Okay, so examples of disaccharides. You already know sucrose, right? You modeled that or used that in the POGL. Maltose would be another example. These are both monosaccharides joined together by dehydration synthesis, which you should know by now, which leads to that disaccharide or 2-monomer sugar, right? So these disaccharides are created in part to move sugars around bodies, in particular plant bodies. So you think of the sap, that's sugar-rich. So maple sugar, maple syrup, is a sap that maple trees create in order to transport sugars around the plant itself. Maple sugar is mostly just sucrose. These are also the types of sugars that you would find in energy supplements. They're more efficient because you have 2 together to move around to package in your energy supplements. They also have a particular flavor that our tongues respond to, and they're very easy to break down into the monomers to get at that energy. All right, so now let's talk about polymers of sugars, i.e. our polysaccharides, right? These could be a few hundred to a few thousand monosaccharides joined together by those covalent bonds. They are really used for 2 purposes. So our polymers of sugar, the polysaccharides, have 2 main purposes: storage of energy and then structure. So let's start with storage. There's actually going to be 2 different forms in plants versus animals. So let's jump into that. Here's our energy storage polysaccharides. You should know starch, right? You've heard of starch in potatoes and pasta. You've heard about starchy foods, and we worry about them when we're worrying about gaining weight because they're rich in energy. They are, and starch in particular, is glucose bonded to glucose bonded to glucose bonded to glucose. It's a repeating chain of glucose. And there's a couple different versions, and it's all about how those chains are built. You can see how there's some branches coming off here. That structural difference, we use it to distinguish some types of starch from others. But you can see here are storage of glucose, right? Here's a chloroplast. We're going to study chloroplast, but it's used to actually synthesize to create glucose. And these are little pockets of glucose being stored in a very efficient form, that long chain. Now, animals do the same thing. They, of course, don't make their own glucose, but they eat plants which have glucose, and they will break down other molecules, free up the glucose, and then form their own storage polysaccharide called glycogen. And it is just glucose bonded to glucose bonded to glucose, but you can see a very different structure than either of these forms of polysaccharides using glucose. And it's all about these branches that we use to distinguish glycogen. And so the structure here is all about storage of glucose. Now, how does an organism get energy from these molecules? This is way too big to get, this glycogen is way too big to get into your cells to break down in order to release the energy. So you might go ahead and guess right now that we have to do hydrolysis to break apart the monosaccharide, in this case glucose, to get something small enough that can actually enter the cell and be broken down for an energy source. So the other type of polysaccharides are structural polysaccharides, not energy storage. An example is cellulose. Cellulose is a great example because it's actually the most abundant molecule on Earth, the most abundant organic molecule on Earth, I should say. And that's because it's the major component of plant cell walls. So all that grass, all those trees, all those other autotrophs around the world using cellulose as its cell wall make it very, very prominent on this planet. It, again, is just made up of glucose, bonded in a unique pattern and unique shape I'll show you in a minute. So what makes this form of a glucose polymer so important for structure is that these long unbranching microfibrils. So imagine these little ropes, all glucose bonded to glucose, little chains, right, that then get bundled together into this tight, strong little bundle that are then woven into strong building material. So it's all of these long chains used together to create a specific type of strength that can be made into the walls of trees that can be, of course, hundreds and hundreds of feet tall. Think of redwoods. So this becomes a very strong, very useful building material that you'd find in leaves and in trunks and in all sorts of plant material. Another building material is called chitin. You might have heard of chitinous shells, shellfish, crabs, lobsters. They use chitin in their exoskeletons. It's a polysaccharide also made of glucose, so the same monomer being used in a very different way, very different structural way, to create this chitinous shell. It's also used in insects for essentially their exoskeletons, and it's also the cell wall of many fungi, so mushrooms, right? Which is the fruiting body of. A quick review, the key concepts I hope that you got out of this is the versatility of carbon in the way it bonds and what it can bond to, allowing for the great diversity of molecules that we call organic molecules, right, carbon-based. A macromolecule structure dictates its function, right, and then I hope that you now have the notion that carbohydrates serve as both fuel and building materials, and hopefully you have some examples with specifics about how carbohydrates does both of those roles. See you.